It's October 18th, and it's 20 plus degrees colder today than it was yesterday. What does that mean? Fall fishing is in full swing, and we're going to talk about that on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey, thinkers, thanks so much for tuning in to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and of course it's brought to you, as always, by the fine folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. Visit them at sportsmans.com or any one of 140 plus stores nationwide. Also, don't forget about the fine folks at Peterson Toyota in Fort Collins, Colorado. They are outdoorsmen and will take care of all of your vehicle needs. Guys, it's the middle of October at this point, and I'm hung between hunting and fishing. Been doing some antelope hunting. I've already harvested those, and going deer hunting the end of the week. And yeah, it's getting to be that time of year. But I've spent all week in the boat and been doing a whole bunch of fishing. And it's a fall season, and I love to fish in the fall. It's one of my favorite times of year to fish, and this past week is probably one of my favorite weeks of the whole year here in Colorado anyway. Typically the weather's beautiful, as it has been, but we've taken a significant turn for the colder here in the last 24 hours, and it definitely feels like fall out. So I kind of wanted to do just a general podcast on fall fishing overall. Not any one specific thing, but just a whole bunch of details that we kind of keep track of in the fall to make sure that we're catching fish consistently. And it's not going to be specific to any one species of fish. I could be fishing for trout. We're going to be trout fishing on Tuesday. Could be fishing for bass, could be fishing for walleyes, could be in the river, could be in the reservoir. So we're just kind of getting out and fishing, and it's time of year to do it. One of the key things to keep in mind for fall fishing in general, just all the way around, is the term hyperphagia or hyperphagia, basically the fall feeding binge. And I've talked about this a bunch on a bunch of podcasts, but really what it means is everybody's feeding up for the fall. And everybody knows winter's coming, everybody being all the animals, all the fish, everybody knows that winter's coming. And it's time to pack on some weight. And even humans do the same thing. We might not think about it, but we always, as a society, tend to gain weight in the fall headed into the holidays. It's not so much about the holidays. It's so much about the shorter days, the increased appetite, the less activity in general. And everybody's come off that summer peak. And so in the case of fishing specifically, the water started to cool. So we have a significant change there. In the case of my home lake, we've even seen a bit of a turnover where the surface temp cooled down into the mid-50s and then sank, pushing the deep water from down below up back to the surface. And that water is low in oxygen, and the lake smells funny, and the fishing's not ideal, but about 3 days from now, it'll be just fine. Most of the reservoirs around our region don't experience much of a turnover, and it's not a significant issue. Really what it's all about is all the bait fish and all of the food sources that are out there for fall fishing. And if you know everybody's feeding, that's a good sign. If you know that every species in the lake is more or less thinking about feeding, with the possible exception of the fall spawners, like a brown trout or a brook trout or a lake trout, all the warm water species for sure are thinking nothing but food at this point. How much of it can they get in their face as fast as they can get it? And that's something that's important to keep in mind when you're fishing, because the easiest fish to catch is fish that are actively feeding for one reason and one reason only. And it's not what you might think I'm going to say. Some people say, well, if you know what they're feeding on, then you can match the hatch. And I'm going to tell you right now, I am not a match the hatch guy. I don't necessarily care a whole bunch about what they're feeding on, with one major exception. And that is, if I know what they're feeding on, I have a better idea of where they are feeding. And that's the most important thing. I use it to locate fish as much as actually catch fish. So, for instance, there's a lake here in town that's a shad-based lake, and I fish it a fair bit. I haven't fished it a whole lot lately, but I do fish it a fair bit. And this time last year, I put the boat in the water. I didn't go looking for fish, per se, on the graph at all. All I looked for was bait. And shad are relatively easy to locate on your graph. If you can find schools of shad and fish around them in a shad-based lake, you're going to catch some fish. And so I didn't have to necessarily match the hatch in terms of throwing a shad style bait, nor did I have to locate specific fish, in this case white bass, wipers, reservoir trout, walleyes, and bass, all feeding together. I didn't have to look for those specific fish on the graph. And so I'm using a forward-facing sonar in this scenario just to locate schools of bait. Because if I locate those schools of bait, I can do one of my favorite tricks of all to get fish to bite. And it's not about the specific lure. If I can get my lure, whatever that lure might be, within that school of bait or right around that school of bait and disrupt the rhythm of that bait, I can draw attention from any sport fish that are anywhere around there. And that's a major thing. And I'll tell you how I learned this as I don't want to say a kid, but as a much younger person than I am right now. Now I'm old, so that's not saying a whole lot. But I was watching schools of snook one time in an inlet in Florida. And snook are a very high-level predator fish, very similar to bass. If you're not familiar with them, they're suction feeders. They tend to school up at certain times of the year, and they will feed on schools of bait fish. So in this case, they were feeding on schools of menhaden, which are very, very similar to shad in terms of how they act and in terms of how they look and the whole 9 yards. They get in big, tight balls, and they're working their way up the edge of this inlet, and they're really grouped up real tight like schools of shad do, and they're working up the edge. And the snook weren't even looking at them. You could see the snook on the bottom, just laid up facing into the current, watching the bait fish, and nobody was catching snook, myself included. And we were trying to catch snook. Everybody along that jetty was trying to catch those snook, and nobody could. And I figured out that the only time they even really moved was when the bait got disrupted by something. In other words, the bait just swimming in a big giant mass up the edge of the inlet using the rocks as a current break. They didn't care about those. But when those bait fish scattered from something, and what made me notice it was a bird came over, and the shadow of the bird went right over the bait, and the bait scattered everywhere, and all the snook underneath them perked up immediately. And I was like, wait a minute, there's something to this. And I was probably maybe 20 at the time, and 20 years old. And so I took my lure, which I was throwing a jig with a 4-inch body on it to match the size of the bait fish within reason. The bait fish are anywhere between about 3 and 7, 8 inches long, something like that. They're good size schools of menhaden. When I took that jig and I snapped it into the school, in other words, threw it out, let it sink below the school, and then snapped it into the school where the hard, aggressive rods lift and pull the bait hard, snap it up off the bottom into that school of bait, and the bait fish scattered everywhere, that's when I got bites. And I figured out they could almost get the snook to bite on command by scattering the bait, jerk the jig right into the school of bait, and then kill it. And the bait scatters every which way away from the jig, and as that jig rolls over at the top of its lift and drop, when it rolls over and starts for the bottom, one of those snook would stroke it almost every time. And it became kind of an epiphany for me. And from then on, the rest of my life, the next 40 years or 35 years, I have tried to scatter bait fish every chance I get. And so back to my original thing about the local lake here. As soon as I can find schools of shad on the sonar or the active sonar, the active target live sonar, either one, I can snap a bait into them, scatter that school of fish, of the small bait fish, and get bit by whatever other species is around there. And that is a trick I have followed forever. It works great, and it's something that I do. So again, I'm not looking necessarily for the individual sport fish. Keeping a white bass or a trout in a reservoir in your sonar beam is very difficult because they swim around full speed all the time, and they don't just sit there like a largemouth or a walleye might and be able to just look at them on the sonar or watch them follow your stuff in. They're darting all over the place, but the schools of shad are more stable and also present a bigger image for you to be able to see on your graph. And whether you're traditional sonar or live sonar, you can follow them and get your lures in those schools of bait. So one of my favorite things to do in the fall is exactly that. And part of this is another analogy or another story or case study, so to speak, for that is 2 days ago here in my home lake, same exact scenario, only now we're talking about smelt that are anywhere between 50 and 60 feet down, 45 to 60 feet deep. and they're thick. It's a big school of them, and they're thick. And you can drop my drop shot into the middle of those smelt, and they will pull away from it. They'll all kind of back away from that drop shot. And as soon as you move it up and down a little bit within the school, all of those smelts scatter away from it, and next thing you know, you've got a smallmouth latched onto the end of your bait. And it's the same scenario where you're using your lure to disrupt the bait fish and get them out of their normal rhythm. And a really good way to identify this is to give you a visual. We've all seen, African videos where there's lions and a bunch of gazelles, and they're all just laying around out there in the middle of Serengeti. The lion could not care less about all the gazelles because they're all just laying around out there doing what they normally do. But if one of those gazelles or a group of those gazelles gets all crazy or spooks from something else, maybe a hyena scared the gazelles and now the gazelles are up and on their feet and moving around, now the lions are interested in them. It becomes a feeding opportunity or a suggestion for them. And that's exactly the same scenario here. We want to disrupt the bait fish, get them out of their rhythm or out of their normal movement, and then leave your bait be the only thing that's left sitting there. And in that scenario, I want my bait to be either bigger or smaller than the bait fish I'm dealing with most of the time. And usually these days, I'll go on the big end of the spectrum. So if I know, for instance, these smelt are anywhere between 2.5 and 4 inches long, well, I want a 4-inch bait then. I was using a 3.8-inch bait to catch these ones the other day. If I know my shad are 2 to 3 inches long, well then I want a bait that's 3 to 4 inches long. I want it to be a little bit bigger because I want to represent the most efficiency I can. In other words, caloric intake. I don't want it to be so big that it's off-putting, but I want it to be on the big end of the bait fish because any of the fish I want to catch will grab that, no problem. And so a smelt, even if it's 6 inches long, is not too big for a keeper walleye or a good-sized smallmouth to grab. So I want to be on the slightly big end of the spectrum. As a general rule, I don't care a lot about color. I'm using my color more to help my bait be noticed in the water column. So if I've got really clear water, I'll use really clear colors or very natural colors. But if I've got stained water, I can still use all the same scenarios. I just use a very bright colored bait, maybe a chartreuse or maybe a hot orange, fire tiger, something like that. So I'm not matching the hatch per se. I'm just using the hatch to give me some idea of where to fish, and then using the characteristics of those bait fish to scare them, basically, so to speak, and get my sport fish fired up. So that's a key thing right there. One of the first things I will do in the fall. Another thing that works really good in the fall for me is any sort of a flutter or erratic drop. It could be a spoon, a traditional jigging spoon, could be a bigger, wider spoon, something like a Johnson Sprite, which is typically a retrieved spoon. It's very similar in shape to maybe a Daredevil you might be familiar with, a very popular spoon, something like that. It's a teardrop spoon. It's relatively thin. It's got a relatively big profile for its weight, and it flutters like crazy on the drop. And that flutter can be really good. A fluttering drop in the fall, particularly if we get a hard cold snap of some sort, which we haven't really had yet. I said it's 20 degrees colder than yesterday, but that's because yesterday was in the 70s and today is only in the 50s. If we get down to a couple of hard cold snaps at night, in the 20s at night, high 20s at night, well, now that fluttering drop is going to be a key thing. So something also like potentially the Berkeley finisher or a gliding jig of some sort can be good in the fall that spirals or glides off to one side on the drop. But again, it's about that drop. And again, for me, that's normally after the first hard cold snap. You'll start to get some die off as water temperatures cool on the surface. Some fish will die. Things like that, and that they will be capitalized on by sport fish. So that's another key thing in the fall for me, is erraticness works really well in the fall, particularly on a vertical drop. So the spoon, a flutter spoon, potentially a blade bait, like a Johnson Thin Fisher, a Berkeley Thin Fisher, could be a good call. A Johnson Splinter spoon, same thing, more of a traditional jigging spoon, very shiny, flat-sided, very erratic, excellent on the fall. Be a good call. And then any sort of my gulp minnow on an aggressive snap jig. So a 3-inch minnow on a jig head. Everybody talks about that these days if you're in bass fishing circles. For me, it's been since the goat minnow came out, I've thrown that same thing for 20 plus years. And you snap jig that thing in the fall, it's going to plane off to the various sides, but again, it's an aggressive snap. So I snap the bait up hard, then let it fall, and snap it up and let it fall. And it's the same thing that I would do if there's bait fish around, but if there's not an area where you're around schooling baits, the same concept. So for instance, I'll be trout fishing later this week, or early next week, I should say. Today's Friday, of course, same as all my podcasts. But early next week, I'll be trout fishing. I will guarantee you I'll be snap jigging and working something very erratic around those trout, even though there's not schools of bait. It's because the water's cooling, they want to feed, they're excitable. And the same kind of concept I said of when the gazelles are all laying around, the lions don't care. But when one of those gazelles starts acting a fool and running around in circles and being all crazy, the lions are going to eat him. And it's the same thing for brown trout they're aggressive in the fall. They're feeding up for their fall spawn, or they just got done spawning and they're feeding afterwards, headed into winter. Either way, the erraticness will get them to bite very well. So that's something that I will keep track of. And so snap jigging or a fluttering drop of some sort is a critical thing for me in the fall. Another really good fall thing, and this one gets a lot less press, but it really shouldn't get a lot less press, particularly in the West where reservoir levels drop. And for the record, my home lake right now is dropping like 6 to 10 inches a day. So they're watering the rest of the corn. Water gets pulled out of here like crazy. It's a 2,000 acre lake dropping 6 inches plus every day. What that does is get all of the bottom dwellers to migrate down with the water. And the specific one that matters most is the crayfish. So as the water drops, those crayfish are moving with it, and it gets them out of their rhythm, and they have to go down with the water, and therefore they're on the march, and they are then easy to catch for everybody in the food chain. So one of the best things you can do in the fall, which gets lost a lot of the time for multi-species, is dragging a crayfish style bait of some sort on the bottom, if you can get away with doing that, if it's not too snaggy. It will work really well for you. And there's a bunch of reservoirs in Colorado where little baby crayfish are a key food source, and they're typically going to be anywhere between about 1.5 and 3 inches long with not overly pronounced claws. We're not talking about the big lobster size ones they eat all summer. We're talking about the young of the year crayfish that are small, and as they migrate, they get eaten like crazy. And reservoir trout, this is a big one. Reservoir trout absolutely love them. So if you're a Colorado guy and you're fishing, Aurora Reservoir, Pueblo Reservoir, any of them. I mean, I could list a whole slew of them that have crayfish in them that the water level starts dropping. And even if it's not dropping, they'll be keying on those crayfish, but the crayfish are very easy for them to get when the water's dropping like it is here. So you'll see trout that are cruising very shallow, particularly in the evening time, and they're picking off baby crayfish. And I know because when you catch one, you put them in the net, he'll throw them up, and they're little, like I said, maybe 1.5 to 2 inches long, and they eat them like crazy, like candy. And for the record, the walleyes eat them as well. And I think at the end of the day, they're just easier to catch than smelt or shad or anything like that. I know they don't provide the food value that a smelt or a shad does, or an alewife or fathead minnows or any of those things provide more food value because they don't have the shell, which is not digestible, but they still require more effort to catch. And if you can swim down the bank and pick off 1-inch crayfish that have no defense, or 2-inch crayfish that have no defenses, then so be it. And again, in the trout reservoirs that I'll go to, I'll fish 1-2 punch. I'll have a very erratic bait that's higher in the water column. Typically, it'll be vertical, some sort of a jig or a Berkeley finisher type thing, something like that. Maybe I'll throw a jerk bait that's really fast and erratic horizontally. I may do that as well, but I will for sure do all my mop up with something like a tube jig or a little baby crayfish of some sort on a jig head tight to the bottom. And for one, you'll pick up big cut bows or rainbows that are feeding around the browns that may spawn. For two, you just get those rainbows and browns both to pick them up because they're eating those crayfish as it goes around. So that can be a really important thing in the fall of the year, and I'll keep that bait in mind. And typically for me, it's a 2.5-inch tube jig, a Berkeley power tube. A little Maxent tube would be good for that, but it could also be something like the little trooper, the little like 2-inch crayfish, very realistic crayfish. I don't generally get too realistic when it comes to crayfish. I believe, honestly, that the more claw appendages you put on the crayfish, or the more pronounced they are, the less bites you get from everything other than largemouth. But that's just me. And so I choose my rubber crayfish bodies like the little trooper. We have less pronounced claws, more in line with what the actual size of the crayfish the fish are eating in the system right now. So as far as bait fish goes, that's kind of my spiel there. It could also be bugs, as far as any sort of heavy duty bug hatch. We've been getting these little snow midge looking things come off here at my house, and the trout will feed on them. They're microscopic, but there's jillions of them, and so the trout will eat those again. But it's all about getting around fish and feeding them with something that's in the ballpark of what they're doing, using scattering bait fish and things like that to your advantage. Let me throw off a couple other let's just say generalities for fall fishing. For one, if you're not getting bit and you're convinced you're around fish, rotate through a lot of baits. More than other seasons of the year in the fall, I will rotate through a lot of stuff. I might take the same crankbait, like something like a lipless crankbait that I'm yo-yoing, which is a favorite of mine in the fall. Rip it through schools of bait fish, scatter the bait fish, and let them eat your lipless crankbait as it drops. For me, that's a Berkeley War Pig. Works great, but I might be throwing that around in a chrome for a while. My bites drop. Rather than switching baits altogether or certainly not switching locations, I will take that same bait and throw it in a hot chartreuse or some really hard bright color instead of the chrome. And give them that. I might throw it one size bigger or one size smaller to give them a mix up that way. So I'm not fundamentally mixing it up as much as I am changing a little bit of the nuances around the edges of my presentation. If I'm catching them really good on say a number 9 hit stick and a gold, well, maybe, but then they quit biting it. Maybe I'll throw the number 11 in gold or the number 7 in gold, or maybe I will take that number 9 and put it in a silver. Pick a silver with a black back on it, or some other color pattern to it, a rainbow trout color or something, some completely different color pattern. And the point is, the fish are around, they are aggressive. If you're just missing a little bit, if they were biting and now they're not, try that first. Maybe I'll go from the hit stick to a stunner, which one slightly rises and one slightly sinks. Then I can work those two. Again, slightly different presentations, but fundamentally the same, and I'll fish them in the same area. Long story short, you can bank on the fact that fish want to feed right now. So it's a matter of rotating through what they want to feed on more than anything else. The other thing is, a lot of the boat pressure is gone at this point, which is important to keep in mind. You're like, okay, there's not near as much guys out there fishing, but the hardcores are out there now. So if you are fishing on a graph and you're watching fish, keep in mind that you're probably right now fishing against the guys who are the best of the season. As in the summer, the whole bell curve is out there. So you get a bunch of very average anglers and a few really good anglers. Now, the best of the best are typically the ones left on the water, same as the ones that are there in early spring. So the fish are getting a little bit more education right now. So if you can get away from other anglers, I will typically do that in the fall. But understand, if those anglers are on the bait, whatever the bait is, whether it be smelt or shad or crayfish or whatever, if they're where the bait fish are, you need to be around them. At that point, you need to just mix it up from there. But long story short, you can count on the fish biting, and that's an important thing. And therefore, if you're not catching them, you need to change lures, change presentations a lot. And so for the trout fishing that I'm doing this coming week, first of the week, I'll probably have, because I'm trying to film and we've got, I don't want to have to make changes too much on the fly. I want to be able to already have them rigged. I'll probably have 10 different rods rigged to go trout fishing. And realistically, I'll catch them on like 2 baits, but I want to be able to rotate through those baits very quickly without having to retie on the deck of the boat. And so I can just throw and set that one down, pick another one up, throw it, set it down immediately after 2 casts, pick another one up, throw it. And the reason is, like I said, I'm just mixing up my presentations to fish that I already know where they are, counting on the fact that if I get the right one, they will bite. Versus the rest of the summertime or any other season, maybe they bite, maybe they don't. But this time of year, they really want to bite. They need the food. Hyperphagia is a real thing. they want to get fat for winter. So fall fishing, it's one of my favorites. Keep yourself warm. Don't forget to drain your outboard thoroughly these days when you come off the water. If your boat's outside, make sure you drain it thoroughly so you don't have some random freeze in the middle of the night that causes you a problem. Fish with an open mind, but also a closed mind. Fish with the mindset that, hey, they are biting, and if I'm not catching them, it's up to me. It's not a matter of are they biting. They are biting, so you need to figure out how to get them to bite whatever it is that you are throwing. So if you want to join the conversation on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and especially our YouTube, I'd appreciate that very much at Fishful Thinker. Hopefully you're listening to our podcast on the YouTube channel and you're already a subscriber, but if not, please like, share, and subscribe. That we'd appreciate it very much. And we have signed new seasons for Altitude Sports Entertainment and World Fishing Network. So starting in January of 2025, season 29 of Fishful Thinker television will debut. We appreciate that. It's amazing to me that we've been able to make it that long. 17 years on TV is a pretty serious accomplishment, and we're pretty happy about that. And it's all because you guys tune in. So thanks for listening. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.